Hello AP students, what's up? My name is Mr. Vogel. I am going to be your instructor for this course, and I'm looking forward to it. I hope we have a good time as we kind of unpack this massive discipline, Psych 101. This isn't a difficult course, but it is a lot of work, and it's really interesting. So a lot of times people do the readings because they find it pretty fascinating, and most people have had a good experience with this class, so I hope you do as well. Again, this is an AP course, so there is going to be a lot of reading and work put on you, and you're going to need to be responsible for that. So I hope you understand the expectation of AP and what they are requiring of you. I am not here to spoon feed you everything, okay? Some of this class, I'm going to just assign certain sections, and we're not even going to cover it in class. Right? So be prepared for that. We will talk about the major aspects, the major portions of the class that I definitely need to cover, that I know are on the AP exam. I know what's going to be on the AP exam. I have a pretty good idea. I don't know exactly, but I have a pretty good idea. I've walked a lot of students through this class already, and I've had pretty successful results with this course compared to past instructors at the school, and so I hope that you will trust me to lead you to the finish line here. But you are going to have to be responsible for your own learning. Okay, so that is my expectation for you. Today we're going to be unpacking the first unit, looking at psychological approaches and perspectives, early and more modern approaches. We're also going to talk about the history and the development of psychology and kind of how it became what it is today, as it's one of the newest disciplines within the social sciences. Okay, so also your book is not going to necessarily follow exactly how the AP College Board course outline or syllabus shows. You're going to see there's 9 units on AP College Board, whereas in your book, I believe there's like 14 units. So just to kind of give you an example of that, for instance, Unit 1 and Unit 2 in your book, we could just call them chapters, Chapter 1, Chapter 2. But Unit 1 and Unit 2 in your book, that equates for Unit 1 of the AP College Board guidelines. All right. So your first unit test is going to be with Unit 1 and Unit 2. So we'll be looking at history and approaches, and then research methods, and then you guys will have a test at the end of research methods, and that's how that's going to work for our first unit test. Okay. So anyway, let's get into some of the learning targets for today. What we're going to be covering here, they are talking about psychological science. How is it a science? Describing how psychology developed through these key understandings of mind and body, looking at the early beginnings of philosophical roots to more modern sciences. 1.6 here, explain how behaviorism, Freudian psychology, and humanistic psychology further development. So we're going to look at some more contemporary, perspectives of psychology, including those. 2.2 here, describe the biopsychosocial approach, and we'll also look at the social cultural perspective as well. And lastly here we have other contemporary psychological approaches like cognition, biology, culture, and gender, which is the social cultural approach. So that's kind of the learning targets we're going to hit for today. We got a lot actually, and your first reading is modules 1 and 2. So we're going to be covering a lot of information, a lot of years, the entire history of psychology in one chapter. Wow, it's a lot. But this is AP. So what I want you guys to do here in the comment box, it's going to pop up here in just a second. We're doing this we're using Edpuzzle, so all these lectures will be posted through Edpuzzle. You won't watch them directly on YouTube, but if you would like to, you can go check out the YouTube link. I don't care. But for your bell ringer, I want you to go ahead and write down 5 adjectives that you think describe a typical scientist. All right? And for the second portion there, I want you to write down 5 adjectives that describe a typical psychologist. All right, so go ahead and take a minute to do that now. All right, so hopefully you had time to finish that task. Let's go ahead and look at these. Okay, I'm just going to put some adjectives on the board here. Methodical, analytical, resourceful, intelligent, thorough. For psychologists, we have accepting, caring, genuine, personable, and attentive. Okay, so these are just adjectives that I've heard students say in the past, and I wouldn't say that necessarily those are wrong, right? But I definitely wouldn't say that every psychologist is accepting or caring or personable or attentive. And a psychologist is also a scientist, right? Because they're also using something called the scientific method in their studies of research and other types of research methods. And so, a scientist can also be these. But also, not all psychologists are technically personable or caring or genuine or accepting. And just a couple examples of that would be Dr. John Money. He did a lot of research on gender neutrality. You can look him up. Okay, pretty interesting story. We may watch a documentary of his, not of his, but about him and his studies on gender neutrality. We do watch it in my sociology class, so we may not watch it in here. And then Harry Harlow, we will talk about him in class, and you will see some videos of his research on attachment. But because of him, because of Harry Harlow, we have the Animal Rights Act, and that's to protect animals because he was extremely abusive to these little macaque monkeys when he was studying his research on infant attachment. So, so just because you're a psychologist doesn't mean you're accepting or caring or genuine or personable. So let's look at how is psychology a science. Okay, so if we look at the terminology here, the textbook definition, psychology, a scientific study of behavior and mental processes. Okay, humans and animals, so it doesn't only apply to humans. Whereas when you're looking at sociology, you're studying the study of human behavior, or anthropology, the study of humans. Okay, psychology is studying human and animal behavior. Now, how is it scientific? Because it uses scientific research methods, right? The scientific method, okay, where we're describing, explaining, predicting, and controlling variables to ultimately understand these specific observable behaviors or these mental processes which we can track and record. Okay, if we look at psychology and its background and the history of it, it kind of has sprouted from two major disciplines. Right, it's philosophy, okay, going way back to Socrates when you're looking at really rational, methodical understandings of human existence. And then physiology, you're looking at the biological side, which we'll be studying more so in units 3 and 4 and 5 as we look at biological basis of behavior, sensation and perception, and states of consciousness. And we'll really kind of see this development of biology as we go on through the course. People kind of get a little bored with those units, but they're really important to understanding the latter units when we get to social psychology and abnormal psychology. So examples, what is behavior? What's an example of behavior? We're just talking about things like things that are objective: smiling, eating, blinking, playing sports, laughing, okay, play, anything like that, anything that's observable. And then mental processes, we're talking about anything that's internal, okay, internal experiences like thoughts, feelings, emotions, sensations, perceptions, dreams, okay, all of these things are more subjective. So how is psychology a science? Because we use the scientific method in these research in our scientific research to understand behavior and mental processes of humans and animals. So let's look at some of the goals of psychology. Okay, the first goal, to describe behaviors and mental processes, right? In order for us to understand behaviors and mental processes, we actually have to be able to describe them, especially when it comes to like the DSM-5. Okay, and we're looking at abnormal behaviors. In order for us to help people, as psychologists, we need to be able to describe what is normal and what is abnormal. So we need to have some sort of measurement process there. Number two, goal of psychology, to explain behaviors and mental processes. So explaining why a current behavior or mental process occurs. And this could be relating to nurture or nature, right? Looking at the biological aspect of it or the nurture aspect of it. What's happening in the home, within the attachment side of things. But let's look at the cognitive development of the child as well. Let's look at, why is the child not speaking at this age, but the child is speaking at this age, things like that. Or why is the child trying to develop their own autonomy at this age and not at this age? We need to understand why current behaviors or mental processes are happening in humans. Next, predicting future occurrences and behaviors of mental processes. It could be the same thing to what I just said in the previous one, but we want to be able to predict what will happen for future generations or the next child that is born when we're studying someone else. When can we expect the child to be able to speak, right? When can we expect language to develop? When can we expect autonomy to develop in this child? And then lastly, preventing or promoting behaviors and mental processes. So, for instance, looking at like abnormal behaviors in the DSM-5, we want to help people, right? So in order to help people, well, one, we need to be able to describe what is normal, what is abnormal, and then also to prevent their case from worsening, we want to be able to promote more desirable behaviors and mental goals for someone. So we do this through things like psychotherapy, right, or pharmacology. Okay, all of these things fall within the realm of psychology and the goals of psychology. So when we look at the pre-scientific roots of psychology, we have these philosophers: Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and Locke. We're just going to briefly look at them. But you see here two major differences between these philosophers. Socrates and Plato, they believed that our mind and our consciousness has some ideas that are inborn, right? They're innate within us. Whereas Aristotle and Locke challenged this and rebelled against Socrates and Plato's philosophy and said that only that which is reality, okay, can be tangible or can be measured. So Aristotle believed that there's no point in focusing on consciousness because you can't measure thoughts or emotions, anything of that kind of nature. You can only measure behavior, so that which we can see. John Locke, an English philosopher, further held this opinion and came up with the phrase tabula rasa, which is known as the blank state. So John Locke's later works then also founded what's known as empiricism, and this is the view that knowledge originates in experience. Okay, it's not something that we're born with necessarily, and so therefore he strongly believed that science is what we should use to rely on our understanding of humans through observation and experimentation. Okay, so focusing on the mind and consciousness is, in his opinion, was a waste of time and didn't make sense because we didn't have anything measurably that we could use to really understand human emotions or perceptions or sensations. All right, so I want you to go ahead, take a second to answer this. All right, there it is. So, again, this was the philosophy of John Locke, and he came up with this when we couldn't measure consciousness, when we couldn't measure things in the mind that we can now measure, and they'll continue to become more and more measurable. as we learn more about the brain. So early approaches of psychological perspectives, you might hear approaches, you might hear perspectives, you might hear schools. They're all the same thing, but these are the four major schools or perspectives of the early approaches to psychology. And that is structuralism, functionalism, Gestalt, and psychoanalytic. So psychoanalytic, don't confuse it with psychodynamic. Psychoanalytic came first from Sigmund Freud, and that later then developed into the psychodynamic approach. But we have contemporary versions of what we use today. There's the new school, and then we have these older versions of psychology. They're the old school. Now, the first individual you need to make sure you know for this class is Wilhelm Wundt. Okay? The reason I say it like that is because he is German. And so in 1879, psychology is now born. All right? Wilhelm Wundt and his student Edward Titchener conducted the very first studies of human consciousness inside a lab environment as they were studying human sensation and perception. And they did this through looking at specific elements of the mind by conducting experiments in regards to emotion, perception, sensation of sounds, questions related to these things, and they used the method introspection in order to do this and perform their research, which later on Edward Titchener would take the same method of introspection and apply it into his studies using structuralism as his approach to trying to understand human consciousness. And so introspection involved asking subjects to reflect on the current internal state of their consciousness. So if we're talking about certain sensations, right, of sound, and I drop something, I would ask that person, identify when you heard that sound. When you heard that loud sound, when did you identify it? And when did you realize that you actually heard it? So I would record that, right, of what introspection might look like in terms of reporting. And structuralism is going to then analyze the intensity and clarity of parts of the consciousness. So again, you're still studying structures like sensation, perception, images, emotion, thinking through this method of introspection, but you're taking it a bit further where you're actually looking at the building blocks and the structures individually. So it's more in depth than what Wilhelm Wundt was looking at. He's actually looking at all of the structures and trying to understand all of these. Introspection, unfortunately, is just very unreliable. You can't really necessarily understand people's perception or sensation or emotion or thinking just through asking them, okay, how did you feel about that, right? It's not very scientific. It's very subjective. And so when we're talking about very complex things in terms of mental disorders or learning, for instance, or cognitive development, introspection is not going to be very useful for understanding human cognition and mental processes. Now, his brain has actually been preserved at Cornell University. So if you ever want to go check that out, going to Cornell University someday, you should go try to find his preserved brain. Later, we now have William James coming into the story here, and he was the first American psychologist who rejected introspection methods. And therefore, instead of trying to focus on identifying all these elements and structures that make up our consciousness that Edward Titchener and Wilhelm Wundt were focused on, he said, let's just focus on the purpose of these elements of the consciousness. So, functionalism focused on how mental and behavioral processes function and what their purposes are. So, how can certain elements enable us to adapt, survive, and flourish? Okay? Instead of asking, how does fear make me feel, I would ask, how does fear enable me to adapt and survive and flourish in my environment? And functionalism. Now, the last school of thought we're going to look at here is, from the early approaches, is Gestalt psychology. So if you're looking for a name that goes with this, Max Wertheimer would be, I guess, the founder of Gestalt psychology. And he would kind of write this in revolt to Wilhelm Wundt and Edward Titchener's study on structuralism, as structuralism focused on all of these different elements to analyze things separately. And he also would kind of disagree with functionalism, trying to understand the function of all of these different elements. Gestalt psychologists wanted to know, well, what's the meaningful whole in terms of perception, in terms of sensation, in terms of learning, in terms of problem solving? What's the of all of these things instead of looking at all these moving parts? Okay. So, review question here. Who is the first American psychologist? Go ahead, type your answer in now. And the answer is William James, the founder of functionalism and the first American psychologist. So now that we've looked at a lot of the old schools of thought in relation to psychology, we're going to look at the more contemporary or modern perspectives and approaches to psychology. So the first one we're going to look at here is the psychodynamic perspective. And the psychodynamic perspective is a modern version of the psychoanalytic perspective. It took a lot of Freud's theories on the unconscious, but it threw out a lot of emphasis on the sexual instincts within the psychoanalytic perspective. So Freud and interesting theories about the unconscious and the human personality and behavior, and how they were associated with a lot of sexual instincts that happen in early childhood. And a couple of these theories were, it was the Oedipus complex and the Electra complex. And we'll talk about those more so when we get into the personality unit. But so while a lot of that was kind of thrown out as very unscientific, there was superego that were used and later came into the development of free association therapy, defense mechanisms, transference, and repressed memories. And so how these things actually are very influential in explaining our behaviors. And other key individuals that have helped the development of the psychodynamic perspective besides Sigmund Freud would be Carl Jung, Alfred Adler, and Erik Erikson. And so Carl Jung and Alfred Adler, you'd probably call them neo-Freudians, but Carl Jung is actually responsible for the development of the Myers-Briggs test. So he didn't actually develop the Myers-Briggs test, but the Myers-Briggs test was heavily influenced by a lot of his theories and research. Now next we have the behavioral perspective, or as it was originally known as behaviorism, founded by John B. Watson down here in the bottom right. And this focuses on how we learn through rewards, punishment, and observation. So behavior is explained by previous learning, okay? It's not something that is necessarily innate. And behaviorists do not believe in anything like free will. So this was the dominating philosophy or school of thought in psychology, really from the 1920s up until the mid-1950s. And these are some of your key founders: Ivan Pavlov, John B. Watson, and B.F. Skinner. So instead of focusing on that which is in the conscious and unconscious, instead of focusing on mental processes like functionalism, structuralism, and the psychoanalytic and psychodynamic perspectives, this school of thought focused on only the observable, that which can be measured, that which is objective. Okay, so there were two major components that helped control and make behavior something that is learned, and that was reinforcement and punishment. Two
methods that were used within the behavioral perspective that we'll talk about later on was the classical conditioning method developed by Ivan Pavlov, which he's pictured right here. And he focused on reflexive behaviors with dogs and salivating dogs and the association with food and a bell. And then you also have operant conditioning, which was developed by B.F. Skinner. I don't have him pictured here, but he focused on voluntary behaviors. So these are your key founders: Ivan Pavlov, John B. Watson, and B.F. Skinner. Later, Albert Bandura would come into the equation, but he's not really technically a behaviorist because he also focused on a lot of the cognitive studies, which he came much later than these other three guys, and so later on in the year. Next, we have the humanistic perspective, and this would focus on how healthy people strive to reach their full potential. Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow would be the main contributors to this perspective, as they focused on bringing people to this full potential through free will, basically. Naturally good, and they just need their needs to be met. So they've got all these particular needs here regarding safety and hunger, thirst, the goal of reaching one's self-actualization at the top here. But before you can get to self-actualization, you need all of these other steps in Maslow's theory of the hierarchy of needs, in which you're not just self-sufficient, but humans is strictly a byproduct of their environment with no real ability to choose who they want to become or the ability to really choose their behavior. It's strictly learned from stimulus responses like the conditioned response and the unconditioned response. The humanistic perspective said, no, wait a second. Like, people actually can choose, have the ability to choose their own behavior. They actually have something called free will. It's not chosen for them, but they can choose who they want to become and the behavior that they want to cultivate in their lives. So this is kind of the main difference between the humanistic perspective and the behavioral perspective. But some of the weaknesses with the humanistic perspective is there's just not a lot of scientific theory and data behind it. Not to say that there's none, because there definitely is some, and it's still very important to the development of psychology. Next, let's look at the cognitive perspective. You've got a couple key figures here: Piaget, Beck, and Albert Ellis. Albert Ellis and Alan Beck will look at when we get into studying different types of psychotherapy. Jean Piaget will look at development when we get into the development unit. But the cognitive perspective is the school of thought that focuses on how we take in, process, store, and retrieve information. So with cognitive perspective, as you can kind of make out, we're looking at explaining behavior through that which is unobservable, that which is internal. The cognitive mind, the expectations, the memories, the attitudes, the emotions, and how all of these things associate with one another in terms of how our brains tick. And so as science has developed and technology has developed, we are now actually able to more so objectively measure what's going on inside of that thick skull of yours, and looking at the brain as it experiences certain emotions like happiness, as it experiences emotions like sadness, or as it goes through serious events of stress or depression. We can see what is going on in that brain and have a more holistic explanation of human behavior through that which is not necessarily observable on the outside. So this really, cognitive psychology has really changed our understanding of human behavior and given us a much deeper understanding, especially in terms of the medical field, on how to treat people and help them with some of their possible neurochemical imbalances. the biological perspective, okay, kind of goes hand in hand with the cognitive perspective, as I mentioned a few things, but biological perspective is strictly focusing on the physical structures and substances underlying particular behavior or thought processes or emotion system, the CNS, the peripheral nervous system. We're talking about genetics, regarding intelligence, regarding just diseases, regarding temperament, athleticism, and how all of these things related to explaining people's behavior, thoughts, or experiences. And so, two key individuals that we'll look at this year that made a lot of advancement in the biological perspective would be Roger Sperry and Michael Gazzaniga on split brain research. And so we'll talk about kind of what they did in terms of the split brain research and removing that region of the brain and seeing how the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere interact with each other. What I'm going to look at here today, hang with me, we're almost done, is evolutionary psych, or the evolutionary perspective. Heavily founded and grounded upon natural, is basically just looking at how natural selection explains our behaviors and mental processes, and how these things are passed down through genes onto our future generations for survival advantages, right? And so on nurture in trying to explain the development of our personality and our life outcomes. Now, something to just keep in mind here is when looking at the evolutionary approach, you do see a heavy influence of racial and gender hierarchy. So there's a lot of evidence that would say Charles Darwin was somewhat sexist or somewhat racist as well, in the sense that he believed that especially Europeans were evolutionarily more advanced than black races, and that men were more advanced than women. So there is a lot of controversy over the evolutionary perspective in regards to that. But, I mean, heck, everything today is deemed racist and sexist, so I don't know. That's just out there in some of the research. So something to keep in mind. But in regards to the evolutionary approach, psychology, but mental and behavioral traits to try to explain the human psyche. Groups. Okay, so this relates to culture, religion, language, socioeconomic status. These are all things that we learn within a group. And so we have these specific behaviors and mental processes every day that are affected by these norms. And an example of that would be maybe individualistic norms and more individualistic cultures versus collectivist cultures. So in the United States and the West, we tend to be individualistic. It doesn't, if you just go to the United States, you'll see it. It's incredibly individualistic. Whereas you come to Asia and it's much more collectivist. And I think there's positives and negatives to both. And I'm seeing that more and more as I've lived in both regions of the world. Lastly here, let's look at the biopsychosocial approach. This is really just a holistic perspective that uses all the different approaches to explain our entire understanding of mental and behavioral processes. But from the biopsychosocial approach, you're looking at the biological side, including the biological perspective and the evolutionary perspective. And then you're looking at the psychological side of things like cognitive, behavior, humanistic, the psychodynamic perspective. And then, of course, you have the social perspectives where you're looking at these learned norms through these associated groups of things like religion and culture and language. And so through that, we're really able to have a holistic understanding of human behavior and mental processes. So for instance, if you're looking at aggression and you're trying to explain thoughts or behaviors related to aggression through the humanistic approach, you might say, hey, there's maybe a lack of nurturing in this individual's life, maybe when they were children, and then through that experience, through childhood experiences, you could say that possibly has created some sort of repression of these memories, and that maybe defense mechanisms have been built up, and so therefore that might be the explanation for the aggressive behavior relating to the psychodynamic perspective. And then you could say there might also be some sort of neurochemical imbalance or disturbance within that child, and so therefore these aggressive behaviors are taking root. And then you could also go into the social cultural approach by looking at some of the other learned norms regarding culture, regarding gender, regarding age or nationality, and how some of these things might have also impacted that child's aggressive behavior. And there you go. You have a holistic understanding of this child's aggressive behavior through the biopsychosocial approach. All right, so that is really it for today. I got a couple questions for you here. I want you to go ahead and respond to this question. Which psychological perspective do you feel is the most accurate in identifying behavior and mental processes? So I'm going to have you go ahead and answer that now. All right, and now that you've answered that question regarding the psychological approaches,